I don't think the Nesiei Chabad are a restricted economy. They're all of ours. The Rebbe is all of ours. The Rebbe Rayatz is all of ours. The Rebbe Rashab is all of ours. And there's also conversations beginning to take shape because there is this phenomenon of secondary ripple effects of the generations of Chabad. Something happened where there's no longer any path of Chassidus that doesn't utilize the light of Chabad Chassidus.
Welcome to Homesick for Lubavitch, a podcast where we explore Lubavitch identity in the year 2025. My name is Bosi Lgani, and I will be your host. Let's begin. Alrighty, we are here in Woodmere, New York, deep in Gullus, with the one and only Reb Joey, or Rav Joey, how do you go by?
Reb Joey.
Reb Joey Rosenfeld. If you know, you know, and if you don't know, you will know. But I came across Reb Joey online a few years ago. I know many people who are very familiar with your writings. Your writings are certainly one of a kind. I think the first time was the first time I saw your stuff was, I don't know if you still do it, where you take like one concept and then each like sniff of Teres Baal Shem you still do it?
It's a book that's waiting to be published.
Like Purim, you have Lubavitch, you have
Maharal, Rav Kook, Tzadok.
Yes. So very, very pithy, very pithy, incisive kind of tweets or posts, and and I've seen much else since. I think we've also communicated sometimes online, one way or another. But anyway, we're here now, and I think we begin with figuring out how is it that a good boy from Woodmere ends up with a beard longer than mine.
Hey, so I'll give the short answer so that we can get to the main point of what we're speaking about. But as a grandchild of Satmar Hasidim from before the war, who went to Auschwitz and came out the other side somehow, some way intact with a broken faith, broken of the old system, and desire for...
Sorry.
Sure. And desire for... Should I start the answer over?
No, it's good.
Okay, I've said it. And so the Shoah always played a really central role in my development, because my father is a child of survivors, and we knew that we came from Satmar, and we knew that my Saba didn't necessarily have a positive view of the tzaddikim that his family had been connected to or came from because of everything that had happened and how things went down, so to say. And so what we found ourselves in is the modern Orthodox enclave, which was 2 generations after the Shoah. So there was the Shoah, there was Auschwitz, and then after coming out of that breaking, my Saba maintained a profound level of a futuristic faith almost, where he maintained the depth of connectivity in spite of the fact that he was able to shed the external garments. My Saba wrote 2 books in Denver, Gemara L'Matchilim and Koach Dehatera Adif. And I always like to look at that as, the response to cosmic tragedy of that kind is only to start again from the Aleph Beis, Gemara L'Matchilim, and also to realize that what Chazal and what the Torah wants to do for a person is make it better, and make it easier, and not worse, and not harder. Koach Dehatera Adif. And so my father was a student of his father and ultimately went to YU and became a student of Rav Soloveitchik and studied a lot of existentialism, which he felt that we should read as well when we went on our spiritual paths and our journeys. But I grew up in a modern Orthodox enclave, also in the shadow of Rav Moshe Weinberger, so the revolution had already begun, where modern Orthodoxy was beginning to receive Chassidus, which was very often the gift that the generation before their parents had carried with them and been destroyed and decimated. But in a modern Orthodox development, there was a relationship to halacha, to Torah, but there was still no depth of spirituality. There was still no access to Chassidus. I had heard of the Baal Shem Tov, but with no interest in it. Jam bands, music, the Doors, Jim Morrison was more interesting to me than reading about the history of tzaddikim. But then, like any modern Orthodox kid, or not any, but a privileged one, I went to Israel after high school and studied for 2 years. And I went to Or Yerushalayim, which is in Beit Meir, which is where Rav Usher Freund says David Malka Mashiach wrote some of Tehillim. And I decided to learn
Beit Meir, the
Moshav.
right outside. Oh,
Yeah,
I've
right
been
outside.
there.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's beautiful.
Gorgeous,
It's
yeah.
a gorgeous, untouched place, and Hari Yehuda are there, so I walked outside a lot, and I really connected to something. I connected to something my dad had sent me with Camus and Kafka and all of the existentialist literature that he thought I should go through also. And I learned how to learn Gemara a little bit, and I broke my head on Gemara. But I decided to take Torah and Judaism seriously. But then when I came back, I started learning the Maharal. And when I started learning the Maharal, something shifted, because then I spent the next year learning Rav Hutner. Then the next year I spent learning Rav Tzadok. Then the next year I spent learning the Leshem. Then the next year I started learning Tanya. And then I found the Mittler Rebbe. And once I met the Mittler Rebbe and his writings, I found a profound familiarity. That's what I would say is the first point in which Chassidus grabbed me, is that it felt like my brain was being hijacked to the degree that how I felt was being expressed on these pages that were written so long ago, especially in the Mittler Rebbe. I found a profound sense of familiarity.
Can you define what like some general ideas?
Sure. So
ideas?
for the Mittler Rebbe, I had always been interested in kind of concealment. As a byproduct of a grandchild of the Holocaust, as someone who was interested in a certain type of music and was always experiencing a certain longing or also anxiety throughout my life. Anxiety is my earliest memory.
Concealment of God?
Concealment of God, but not aware that that's what we were talking about. Just concealment. There was something missing.
Concealment of your parents? You were scared of your parents?
Those were some of the fears in its manifestation, but ultimately the general framework and the common denominator was that it was just an awareness of something missing.
Uh-huh.
What was missing, I wasn't sure, but there was always a perpetual sense of a need for more and a craving for more and the desire to find that moreness, but also laziness or the disability to find it. So it was kind of just an unrequited longing. And I was a teenager, and there were books that like conveyed and Catcher in the Rye and all of the culture and the counterculture. I found myself in texts and in the history of the Grateful Dead and in the history of poetry and all of those different zramim that held certain kind of sparks of familiarity, a textual encounter that I actually felt something. But then when I started learning the Mittler Rebbe, especially I think I started with Kuntras HaSpalus. I started with Kuntras HaSpalus. And what I remember reading a line from the Mittler Rebbe that he quotes his father, who's quoting his teacher, and he brings it down also in Shar HaYichud, that Efshar lahavin esraze da'iraisa la'amkam ula'amisam ela mi sheyesh lo hamara shchoira hativis hamushush bo meneuruv hanikrat zabrachenkait kamo shekasav b'maimer chazal ein moisen markava ela lamisha libo doi bekirbo. That he received in tradition that it's impossible to understand the depth and truth of Maimrei Chassidus or Pnimius HaTorah unless a person has a certain tendency towards a melancholic spirit, which is referred to as Tzabrachenkait, and this is in fact rooted in Chazal that say that you can't give the secrets of the chariot over to anybody other than one who is anxious. And so at that point I said, wait a second. Here we see that all of the inner states that I feel, which I've often seen to be the opposite of a spiritual ideal, because one wants joy and one wants faith and one wants simplicity and one doesn't want that Tzabrachenkait, that sense of something missing. In the Mittler Rebbe, it was transformed into the very stone upon which a relationship to God and Torah and light can be revealed. And so later on did I discover that all I was encountering was the notion of Bina, right, which is what the Mittler Rebbe was, but I saw it most pronounced in the language of the Mittler Rebbe, especially in Toras Chaim with Orus de Tohu B'Kelim de Tikkun, and how Esav to a certain degree is higher than Yaakov, and the Misparer is higher than the Mevarer. This shift, a complete overturning of the binary oppositions we typically orient ourselves to, which now makes us realize that, absence is actually higher than presence, and darkness is higher than light, and the Kli is mushrash in a place that's higher than the Or.
Right.
And I fell into a real obsession with that type of mahalach.
Fascinating. I don't know if you heard the story, but I heard the story from someone who heard it from, I think, I think I already quoted on the podcast, and I misquoted who said it, so I'm not even going to try again. But the line I remember, that there was a chossid in Australia. This was the year after the Frierdiker Rebbe passed away. So chassidim were trying to get a handle on who this potential new Rebbe was going to be. The son-in-law, who up to that point had been quite reserved. And one chassid in Australia told another chassid that he's a feilche zerbrochene yid, or zerbrochene freiliche yid. Like the definition of the Ramash was a broken, happy person. As poor of a translation as that is,
It's both and at the same time.
right? No, but I don't know if zerbrochen it can really be translated as broken and freilich as happy. But for the as best as we can do in English.
Absolutely.
So yes, there's certainly something in that.
Yeah, there's a deep, I mean, the Nazir, the main Talmud of Rav Kook, identified, Chabad Chassidus as part of the ancient path of almost a pessimistic approach.
Yeah, well, Chassidim Rishonim Haishayin Shah Achas Mispalin, and that comes in Behemshich to a Mispalin Elmitoich Kavod Reish. And yeah, I was just yesterday in the shul that I daven in. They asked me to give a shir in the Chudei. So I said, it's between Mincha Ma'ariv. Let me do next week Ba'aleischa that we just read, and that's what Ba'aleischa is about. And the Chudei is about the Shemen Zayis. You have to
Crush it.
You have to crush the Zayis to bring out the Shemen, and the Alter Rebbe brings a beautiful thing from Reb Chaim Vital about that there's a closeness that one finds precisely through the dimasi, and the vart is a beautiful vart. How to see something that your eyes can't usually see. Sometimes you can only see that through tears. Like the clearest vision is sometimes clouded by tears, right?
And longing.
Right. No, but the eyes. Oh, we need to have clarity. We need to see. If you have 20/20 vision, then you see things. Like no, maybe not. Maybe if your eyes are misty with tears and they're blocked with,
Specifically because the closer one comes to closing their eyes and realizing that I can't see anything, they come closer to seeing what they can't see. And I don't mean that to be a trick of language. I mean it to be what the Rebbe Rashab describes as the apex of what we're capable of grasping. He'elem ha'atzmi.
Right.
Essential concealment.
Right.
Which means to say we have to really reorient our entire positioning of what it means to relate to ourselves, God, and the world. That there's a part of Chabad Chassidus clearer than anybody else, but it's expressed throughout most tzaddikim, that there's a path where being human and owning the human condition and engaging in it and leaning into it and being mitmoded with it is the only path towards the highest level of experience. This is obviously expressed explicitly in the Tanya, which I really only came to understand after. This is basically what the Tanya is about.
Which part?
The ishafcha at the core of it. To me, the Parak Lamed Vav is ultimately the point in Sefer Shel Beinanim that highlights the true secret that the Alter Rebbe was coming to give us, which is that Ratzah Kadosh Baruch Hu lios lo dir b'tachtonim.
Right.
And a choshech kaful u'mechupel ad she'ein tachton yoter tachton mimenu be'inyan hastaras alikos.
Right.
That's where we are, and if that's where we're supposed to be, then I have to stop looking at it with eyes of mournful, post-traumatic eyes that say, oh, if only things were clear. And I have to say, no, this is what Hashem wants, in whatever way a person has to grapple with it, and this is where I'm going to find him.
Right. Yeah. Beautiful. We could dive down this rabbit hole for a long time, but I don't want to get caught up in
and we'll come back to this. This will be the Nakuda.
But I want to ask you, when you were starting to read this, starting to learn these things, how did you relate to this sefer? Was it another sefer? Was there what was it just an idea without, you were in Israel at the time, right? Lubavitch makes itself known in Israel in all kinds of ways, and I'm sure you were aware of the different kinds of shapes and colors, primarily the yellow color, right? And are you like, wait, there's this idea, but I'm just taking it as as an academic?
It's very interesting there was a growing trend in the Torah of Eretz Yisroel, Rav Shagar, and all of these kind of postmodern approaches to spirituality, which are trying to retrieve the light of the Baal Shem Tov and the modern and postmodern sensibilities that are contained within them, that kept on bringing it back to the Alter Rebbe, kept on seeing the Alter Rebbe as really this final say. One line of the Alter Rebbe from the Likutei Torah was enough to base an entire theory of language upon for some of these tzaddikim in that world. And I began to see it as, okay, this is another zerem of not machshavas Yisrael, but a way of thinking. And then I merited to have a sefer across my table, which was Rav Yoel Kahn's Musagim B'Torah Chassidus.
Sure.
It was a 2-volume set.
Sure.
And I still have mine at home, and I learned that really well, and I learned it very deeply. And that's for sure the first time that I began to feel that I had any tfisa on even the language that was being used. And I didn't come to understand Yichud Tata, Yichud Ilah from Kabbalists and then came to the Alter Rebbe. I learned that language from Rav Yoel Kahn and getting a general grasp of those perspectives. And so I began to see Lubavitch far more than a movement or a particular Hasidic lens, and another zerem of thinking about Hashem and relating to Hashem.
Right.
This is because we're an orphan generation, and there was a growth of these orphaned mashpiyim. In particular, the various tzaddikim that popped up in our generation who were not necessarily connected to Chabad. They were, in fact, connected much more to Rabbi Nachman.
For
like Rav
example,
Meyer Morgenstern, who I try and consider my tzaddik and my Rebbe, and I try and connect him as much as I can. Rav Avram Slik Luger, the Bilvavi Mishkan Evner, Rav Matel Zilber.
so where did your Rebbe come from? What's his story?
So before we get to my Rebbe, these 4 individuals, they were all teaching Chassidus in their own way. Some were Breslov, some were teaching Rizhin, but they were all utilizing the language of Chabad. They all had the full set of the Tzemach Tzedek on their shelves. They all had the writings of the Rebbe Rashab on their shelves. They all had the writings of the Rebbe on their shelves, and Likutei Torah. Something happened where there's no longer any path of Chassidus that doesn't utilize the light of Chabad Chassidus. But by shifting it away of being a Chabad chossid, where that Chassidus now became part of a particularized curriculum, it became a life force of real potent baseline Hasidic thought that influences every other zerem of Chassidus. He gave us the Maggid of Mezrich, meaning without Chassidus Chabad, we don't have the Maggid. And so it was the ability to use Chabad Chassidus without being a Chabad chassid, but a Talmud of them.
Homesick for Lubavitch is brought to you by Yuvla Media, a boutique video production company servicing the Chabad and Jewish community. Since opening 10 years ago, Yuvla Media has pushed the boundaries of artistic and thoughtful storytelling in the community, with an insistence on there always being a memorable story as well as a beautiful and striking visual image that we believe is second to none. Over the years, we have worked with Chabad organizations around the country, as well as large organizations like Boni Olam, Torah Masorah, and Atzalathon, guided by the belief that your story is absolutely worth telling with depth and creativity. If you are looking to tell your story with a video, please reach out to us at hello@yuvlamedia.com. Again, that is hello@yuvlamedia.com. A link can be found in the show notes. And now, back to the podcast. It's very interesting, this idea that you said the orphan generation. I think it's worth spending some time on, because it doesn't sound like you mean that in a purely negative or downcast sense.
No, God forbid. I think there was a breaking with the nepotism.
All right. I think you posted about it once, yeah.
There's holy nepotism. The holy nepotism is something that we believe in. And we see how that happens, that the children of tzaddikim are sometimes very big tzaddikim.
Right.
But we also know that as we get later and later into history, that's not always the case.
Right.
And family name alone is not enough to carry on the spiritual principle. Sometimes we see it worked very well, and sometimes we see that it works less. The orphan generation, in the sense that in the wasteland of post-Shoah reality, there was the knowledge that Torah Chassidus needed to be revived, even though the world of Chassidus may have been destroyed. And so the first person you had who did this was Rav Ara Larot, who out of kind of the ashes of the Shoah, who was a mashpia, he wasn't a Chassidish Rebbe, but he became one by dint of the Torah that he carried. Sholem Lahavdil says that, like, if you want to see anything interesting nowadays in the time that he was writing it, you could go to the two Avrams, either of Avram Yitzchak Cohen Cook or Rav Ara Laroth in Mea Sharim. Because I think he saw in it a phenomenon that was new, which was the emergence of Chassidus really for the masses.
This Rav Arla Roth.
Yeah.
Did he build a new school of Chassidim?
Shomer Amunim. Shomer Amunim Chassidus. But he gave us...
But does he have like a group of Chassidim?
Yeah, it was told us Avram comes from him.
Told us Avram.
But what he gave in his writings, more significantly than anything else, the Shomer Amunim, the Taras HaKodesh, was a collection of all of the tzaddikim together. Baal Shem Tov, and not only the Magid Derech, but the Tolas Yaakov Yosef Derech, which you don't get when you only learn Chabad Chassidus. And quoting from the Bnei Yissaschar, and quoting from all of the Talmidim, and then you get to see similar language.
Yeah, it's very interesting, this idea, because it's you phrase it as nepotism, but I think even without, I mean, maybe it's the same thing, but there's just this fact of history that there needs to be reinvention from time to time. I don't know if that's what you meant.
Every revolution needs a revolution.
Right.
Yitzchak was not carrying the message of Avram Avinu like
Right.
Eliezer was. Eliezer was doile umashka,
Right.
from the wells of his master. Yitzchak was novelty. And what's novelty? It's the capacity to maintain the inner kernel of what the previous generation had while innovating it enough to make it its own thing.
Right. Yeah, so it does seem, I grew up in a Lubavitch family. I consider myself a Lubavitch chossid. In a sense, I don't have that freedom that it sounds like you have to pick and choose or to kind of create your own identity or your own diet, let's say. But I think there's a strength and a weakness to it. On one hand, there's I kind of know who I am or what I think or like what I read or what I think is important. But there's also a certain straitjacket to it where it's like, is this really how I think? Right. And is it, do I really, is everything, am I just saying it because I have to say it, or am I saying it because that's right? And so it comes almost back, maybe I'm a little bit oversimplifying it, but it comes to that kind of core question of modernity, or maybe even post-modernity, which is, tradition versus authenticity. Right. And the postmodernists or the existentialists will tell you, it's wonderful to have your categories and everything make sense, or think that they make sense, but wait until it breaks and then good luck, right? Better to acknowledge upfront that nothing makes sense and the world's utter chaos, and just try to be as true as you possibly can, right?
Yeah, the way you're describing it is very poignant, and I think that Eli Rubin ultimately, is the one who really captures this territory, and where there's a middle option, which is discontinuity and continuity at the same time, which is the secret of the Hamshacha.
Right.
But that's also returning to the pure textuality
Right.
of Chassidus Chabad as being indicative of the unfolding of its history, which is what Rebbe does so beautifully.
Yes.
But I do think I think that this happened to Chassidus. Chabad wasn't necessarily involved in it, but Rav Simcha Bunim of Pshischa came along, and he looked at the current stage of Chassidus, where everyone had become a Rebbe and everyone had their palatial tishin, when what was most devoid was any spirit. And Rav Simcha Bunim came along and created a revolution to the degree that they were almost excommunicated, and that gave birth to Kotsk, and that gave birth to Gur, and that gave birth to Alexander, and that gave birth to Polish Chassidus, and Ishbitz, and Radzin, which are markedly modern. And you would be amazed to find that as big of an impact as Chassidus Chabad has on this, not nation movement, but of modern Orthodoxy that is retrieving the birthright of their relationship to Chassidus that hadn't survived the Shoah. Right? Chassidus Chabad ostensibly survived the Shoah.
Well,
even though you don't survive it, there was a shock absorber strong enough of the Rebbe Rayatz and the Lubavitcher Rebbe to make it seem like there was a bridge.
We were also not we were also mostly in Russia.
Exactly.
There were a lot of Chassidim who were killed by the Nazis, but the majority were not.
Right. But after the desire for more comes in, and we discover this nature of Chassidus, Ishbitz and Radzin has as much of an influence on kind of the modern, mistakenly referred to as neo-Hasidic perspective. It's not neo-Hasidus because that's something else, but it's neo in the sense that it's retrieving something that was old and bringing it back with freshness.
So I guess the question then becomes, there's one thing to say that the implementation or the culture is stagnant, is becoming, like you said, nepotistic, or just I think just overall performative, lazy, a scab as opposed to healthy tissue. But the ideas, you would think if the ideas are true, then the ideas should be able to survive the test of time, right? So, is there a need, to create a revolution in ideas?
A Chabad library is, on a certain level, one of the most astonishing things to encounter, because we have, let's say, at least 20,000, if not more, ma'amarim. I might be overestimating. I said 100,000 the other time I made this point. But every mimer, and I'm not even talking about the books.
A ton of them got burnt also, so I think you're probably...
I'm not even talking about the books, the svarim that were meant to be read.
Right.
We could talk about the miracle of the notion of a book that's meant for an individual reader, which is a paradox that the Alter Rebbe introduced.
Right.
But the ma'amarim themselves, when I walk in and I see all of the Nesiim and all of the ma'amarim, either I'm going to be overwhelmed by the sheer vastness of it, because it's all saying something different and I have to hold cup on all of this and I might as well just read whatever my teachers tell me to read. Or I can look at it and say, if the Nasi and the Tzaddik Hador took the opportunity to access Dveikus by way of public hisboinenus.
That's how you see a mimer.
To a degree or not. I don't know the text. I think the textuality of it is very significant, but it's their process of reaching God through the maze of the Seder Shtalshalos, typically from the bottom back up and then from the top back down, based on the pasuk. And so if they believe that it should be placed into the text, so those are no longer ideas that are read, but they are portals to one degree or another. Like if I want to experience godliness the way that the Rebbe Rashab revealed it to be a fundamentally real path of grasping godliness. Why? Because the tzaddik said it at that moment and it's congealed in his words for eternity. Then when I'm reading those words, the purpose is to connect to God. The purpose is to trace these elements back. Meaning to say the hisboinenus element of it, to think about it. But for me, hisboinenus wasn't sitting there, walking around with a talis over my shoulder and pacing back and forth. Hisboinenus was trying to grapple with reality as an anxious person, as a person who's grappling with college. And so the need to translate the ideas within the ma'amarim and to live with them became, what does Soviet Kalamim mean for me? What does Malak Kalamim mean for me? What does L'Gevuros mean? What does Chesed mean? Meaning we have to break open the terms and connect to them. So the terms themselves are not enough.
Right.
But the way in which we approach the severity and the depth of what these books convey to us is the impact they're going to have on us. Does that make sense?
Yeah, actually, I was just learning my new favorite hemshich of the Frierdiker Rebbe, Tafshin Aleph. It's a Pesach hemshich, about 50, 60 pages. And in general, the Mamarim, this is from the first years of the Frierdiker Rebbe in America, and the Mamarim of those years are very different, very basic, teaching newbies and or normies, like they like to say today. And 30 pages or so, at least the first half of the Hemshech, is all about what hisboinenus is. And not to get carried away with the whole thing there, but just to your point, the way he teaches hisboinenus is, once you have understood the idea, or you've kind of broken down the idea into its different segments and defined the idea the way your mind takes it in, hisboinenus is reviewing the idea and getting back to, did I understand it correctly? Did I get the foundation of the idea right?
The core of it.
The core of it.
Not the details, the
no,
abstract.
That's the whole
core.
point. The whole point is hisboinenus kind of challenges the hasaga and tries to reassert it on a truer foundation. So in many ways, that's what you just described, where there's taking an idea and say, okay, I think I understand what the mimer said, and I understand what the arguments were to this side, to this, and I kind of get the shape of it. But if I don't relate to it, if I don't know what...
Even that is sad. To me, I don't care if I understand the complexity of the mimer. If I read one line in the mimer and it gives me an insight into the soul, so that line becomes the point at which I'm joining the stream of this Rebbe's expression of their aliyah. It's a technology.
Right, but you said that you wanted to, as a young man, you wanted to translate the words what the Sefer Kalman mean. Right. And that is what his hispanus is,
Absolutely.
What I'm saying.
Translation, it's targum.
His hispanus is, and I don't know what they did when they were carrying their talesim. It's very possible they're doing the same thing. It's very possible
they were holy and they were righteous and they were the chassidim harishonim.
Yeah, maybe the artist made them look good. I don't know.
but there's a piece that I'm missing in this, and I wanna stress it. Louis Jacobs wrote a book, The Seeker of Unity.
Okay.
About Rav Aaron Halevi.
Okay.
And Rav Aaron Halevi, to me, like I said before, the Talmidim of the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe and the Tzemach Tzedek are as significant to me as the Nesiim, primarily because I'm not a Lubavitcher chossid. So I can spend time learning Rav Hillel Paritcher. And I can spend time learning the Ma'amarim of Rav Yitzchak Isaac Hamler. And I can spend time learning the Torah of Rav Aaron Halevi, which is saying something different or a little bit more nuanced than what the typical descent of the Seder Shtalshalos of the Nesiei Hador are doing, especially as it's translated. It's far more chaotic, it's far more Kabbalistic, it's far more emphasizing the selfhood of it all.
Right.
Meaning the entire library of Rav Aaron Halevi's writings can theoretically be seen as a commentary on the 36th chapter in Tanya of Dir B'Tachtonim, what it means to be a self. Without the running back to abstraction, there's a real lived experiential Torah at the heart of Chabad that I believe the Alter Rebbe reveals hidden, scattered without the prakim of Tanya, embeds deeply in Chinuch Katan, which is the reality that we'll never get it right, and that's why we have to always hold what we think is right and what we know is wrong at the same time.
Right.
Gets expressed most potently in the last mimer, which is Nefesh HaShvala, which is where the Alter Rebbe at the end of his life basically said the only goal down here is to make shalom in a place of lies and to descend down in a place of ta'anos shel sheker, the dir b'tachtonim. And then when you start learning the Mittler Rebbe and Shar HaYichud, exactly like you're talking about, the whole question is what's more important, the klal or the prat, the whole or the particular. And what he reveals there is the fundamental necessity that both have on one another. And so the prat is suddenly this disintegration, this fragmentation, this self, the thing that I understand better than any of the Nesiim, because I'm in that place.
Yeah.
And I live that way. And my surroundings are that way. So that severity, when you find wisdom that was speaking about that place so beautifully, and ultimately revealing the redemptive quality of Malchus over Zer Anpin in the end of the day, and Eishes Chayla Teres Baila, and all of those intense, potent, beautiful teachings that reveal that life is the opposite of what we thought, and the concealment where we find God most, that was not only music to my ears, it was medicine. It was medicine. And because I came in with these issues, or these problems and thought, the Ma'amarim of Chassidus became medicine.
Yeah, look, this is very well accepted in Chabad as well. I don't know about in practice, but in concept, like maybe Rav Aaron Halevi is a little bit more controversial, but Reb Hillel Paritcher is Placharim, his or at least some of his farm is very famous in Lubavitcher Yeshivas. I don't know how much people learn it,
but that's important because the curriculum cut off a lot of this.
No, but I'm saying it's not like we're discouraged from learning it, but there is a story that's long been one of my favorites, at least on this topic, which is Reb Hillel Paritcher. He was a chassid of a number of the Rebbeim. So I don't know which Rebbe this was with, but he heard a mimer, and afterwards he chazed the mimer, and the Rebbe or one of the Rebbe's children said, "No, that's not what the Rebbe said." He said, "No, but this is how I heard it.
Right.
This part belongs to me.
That's what matters.
This part belongs to me. Like what the Rebbe said is for his ksafim, but this is what I heard."
This is the most important point of all.
Yes, and I to me this is everything, and this in many ways becomes a massive source of tension in the Lubavitcher's experience, which is, do I have a right to an idea of my own, or is my entire, or am I like, What if I think differently than the Rebbe almost?
So I love this question because I think that when you look at the writings of the Baal Tanya and the Mittler Rebbe, at least in the books that were published, not Ma'amarim, what you find in the Hakdamos of the Machabrim is that there's always the phrase Kol Chad Lefum Shira Dilei, right? Which is a riff on the Tikkuni Zohar, which on the pasuk of Eishes Chayil Ataris Baila, which teaches us that Noda B'Sharim Bala, that he will be known in the gates of town by dint of the greatness of his wife. But Noda B'Shiri Dilei, he will be known, God will be known in accordance with the conjecture and the estimation of our own heart. Mm-hmm. That Achas Dibar Elokim Shtayim Zu Shamati, we don't have to come and rewrite the Maimer, God forbid, in order to value our interpretation, which is our own singularity. Interpretation is interpreted through the particular frame of our interpretive devices, our mind, heart, body. And so it's about owning the singularity of the light that comes down in a mimer or in the Sefer, but also owning my capacity to receive it in accordance with my own vessels. That's what the Baal Tanya did in Sefer of Tanya. The Baal Tanya couldn't continue with Yechidus, A, because it wasn't tenable, and B, because he cared. He cared about the people coming into the room, and there's just so much. And so the Baal Tanya, the miracle, what he describes in Hakdamas Machaber is that I'm giving you a book that will stand in the place of Yechidus, and as long as you knew me and you loved me and you love me, and the Meforshim all say that that's not dependent on face-to-face knowing. As long as you trust that I'm a source that's conveying wisdom from Har Sinai, then you will receive these words in accordance with what you need to receive in them. Right. There's a story, my favorite story covers this, is that there's a story about, there was a chassid who came to the Baal Tanya, and he said he had to go to whatever town it was for business. And the Baal Tanya said, take the book, take Tanya, and just come and report back to me if anything strange takes place. So at the end of this chassid's trip, he went to the theater. And after a show, the usher was cleaning the aisle, and he came and he looked at it and he said, what's this book? And he leafed through it and he said, very nice. And he walked away. This chassid came back to the Alter Rebbe. And the Alter Rebbe said, did anything happen? And he didn't think of anything. He said, anything? And then he repeated, well, there was somebody who nodded at the book and said, very nice. And apparently the Baal Tanya was Malei Simcha V'Chedva as a result of that. And the story goes as follows. The Masorah in Chabad is that was the Rosh of the Lamed Vav Tzadikim of the generation. But then there's another, at an endum to the story, that there's another way of understanding it, that no, the Usher wasn't the Rosh of the Lamed Vav Tzadikim, he was the Rosh of the Lamed Vav Rishayim. And that the Alter Rebbe was happy because even the other side was acknowledging that his book was very good. The way I see that is that Tanya hijacks the self because it speaks to both parts of the self. It speaks to both parts of you. It speaks to the tzaddik in you, it speaks to the Rosh in you.
All right.
And both parts have to be maskim to the book.
Yeah. Going back to the Fidik Rebbe's Hemshech, is that when you have the Hanafas Omer of the Korban Omer, they would I don't know what the English words were. When they would shake it, they would shake both the actual flour as well as the shells. And the Fidik Rebbe explains it has to include both sides. It has to include also the klippa, also the shells of the psilus, the stuff that you want to get rid of. That's also part of what you have to work with.
But you know where the problem is also, and this is another symptom, is that the separation between Kabbalah and Chassidus, that people like to quote the Rebbe Rashab on, that Kabbalah is a perush on Chassidus.
Right.
So the misunderstanding of that, along with other general misunderstandings that came out at that same time, like that Atzmus Yisparach is graspable to some degree.
Yeah.
And that only halavai beinani, and I can't be a tzaddik also. These three elements convey the wrong idea of what Chassidus is. That if we cut Kabbalah off from Chassidus, Chassidus becomes something that's very close to Christian theology, God forbid, to the degree that it seems like a closed system that can be completed.
So what? Maybe we take a step back. What do you mean? What do you mean by that? And what do you mean by Atzmos being graspable?
So all of Chassidus is ultimately talking about our relationship with the essence of God.
Right.
But it's about what happens after the essence of God is concealed or undergoes a certain form of Simsum. Now, the highest level, the Simsum Ritzonit, that original dilug, what the Lubavitcher Rebbe termed the Simsum Hamavhil, the wondrous thing that took place before the beginning of anything, already dictates to us that all we are ever grasping is the essential expressions of godliness. Right. That whenever the tzaddikim are using the lashonos of atzmus, it's always, at least up until, the later generations, it's always with the additional phrasing of shmo ha'atzmi, or ziv ha'atzmi, or ha'atzmi. None of those things are the etzem of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The etzem of HaKadosh Baruch Hu can only be grasped by way of derech hashlilas hashlila, and nimne hanimnos, as the Rambam, as Ramash describes in the Hadronim, that there's no grasping God. Leis machshava tvisa beklal. And even if itvasu beruusa deliba, right, that doesn't mean you're grasping the essence. That just means you're coming more into an awareness that you can't grasp the essence. The notion of grasping the essence of godliness, grasping, I'm saying, is a very difficult idea to base any type of system around, because what does that mean in terms of the recipient of that information? If I can grasp atzmos, or the notion of atzmos, even the notion of grasping it is impossible to kind of get stuck into. But look, the question is...
Wait, so it's a problem if you can't grasp it, or it's a problem if you can?
If you say that you can, you're being magshim it, and you're turning it into an idol.
So that's a problem.
That's the problem. The problem is that people walk around nowadays, right, thinking that atzmos, or the essence of God, is something that has been revealed and is graspable.
Yeah, they have atzmos on speed dial.
That's the problem, because atzmos only represents a placeholder, right, for that which we cannot grasp. Now, it's very important to note, we're not talking about the presence of God's infinitude or not. That's not what the conversation ever has been. It's about graspability.
No, that the Rebbe said that the simplest people have a handle on the presence of God. Yes, of atzmos, of the essence of God's presence. They have a handle on Him being present, but not on what it is.
Exactly, and there's been a shift, and what I understand it to be, although I don't know the history well enough, is that the mashpiyim after the 5th generation, and the Rebbe Rashab revealed more than other generations. If you read the frightening words of the Lubavitch Rebbe about Hemshech Ayin Beis, right, I mean, he understood that there was something cosmic afoot in the publishing of these writings. Yes. And Samach Vav already begins to bring it out. Yes. But God forbid, heaven forbid, for us to ever think that the Rebbe Rashab or the Lubavitch Rebbe Bosi Lgani was claiming that the Jewish mind can grasp atzmos. Right. No matter how far we go, by definition, we have to assume that kedushasi l'mala mikedushasechem. This comes out most explicitly in the Tzemach Tzedek, in countless places, but nobody's learning them.
Spring is here, which means that in 2 months, many communities will be looking for a way to mark Gimel Tammuz, the Rebbe's yahrzeit. If you're looking for an event that is memorable, meaningful, and affordable, let me recommend This World is a Garden, a film and live concert production created by us here at Yuvla Media, inspired by Bosi Lgani, the first mimer, the Rebbe said. If you're a regular here at HFL, you know that Bosi Lgani is something that we think about and talk about a lot. And in this production, we use the power of cinematic filmmaking and a live concert by a string quartet to bring the beauty of Bosi Lgani to your community and your audience in a way that they've never seen, heard, or experienced it before. The production has already been hosted by Chabad houses around the country and has drawn wonderful reviews. Our package comes with everything that you need to put in the production: the film's original arrangements for string quartet, publicity materials, everything besides the string quartet, which we recommend that you hire locally to save on travel costs. To find out more about this production, please visit thisworldisagarden.com. Again, thisworldisagarden.com. And now, back to the show. So you feel that if I'm just tracing your idea correctly, you feel that this idea of Kabbalah being a parish on Chassidus, or like the Kabbalistic approach being subservient to Chassidus, allows Chassidus to basically do away with the mysticism.
So good. So this is the second shlav of the answer. So that's the problem with atzmos, right? What does Kabbalah teach us? Especially Kabbalah that's seen through the second iteration of the writings of the Arizal, which is Svardi Kabbalah of Shalom Sharabi, is that it relativizes infinitude. And it ensures that really every level of grasp is deficient in relationship to that which is above it, whole in relationship to that which is below it, and both whole and broken in relationship to itself. We know this from the language of Kabbalah, gar and vak, or atzilus and briyetzir and asiya, these two perspectives. Now, every level of grasp that I have to be simultaneously aware that there is now a new level of grasp that is above me.
Right.
So it's alios ein kates.
Right.
And that even when one were to come to the highest level of Radla, at the end of the day, all that reveals is the Malchus that is above it, the Shmo Ha'atzmi, or Malchus de Ein Sof, as the Arizal brings down. So if I am learning Chassidus without that protective device of erchin, of relativity, that no matter what level of Kesser I grasp, all that is the Malchus of the lower world, ad infinitum, never grasping the essence, because to grasp the essence is heretical.
Right.
Because then either I'm susceptible to the essence or the essence is diminished to my capacity. So what Kabbalah does is it protects the Hagshama Sadavarim, because it says even when you get to the top of these phrases, all that means is that you're now transplanting and abstracting the frame back to a level higher and higher and higher. Chassidus without Kabbalah, you just have the proper names, and then you're dealing with terminology and forgetting about the perpetual growth process and the infinite gradations of spiritual growth that must remain in front of the person at every moment.
Very interesting. Very interesting.
You hear the connection?
I do hear the connection. I'll let me throw something at you. Tell me if I'm understanding it. There's this idea that's spoken about in Bosi Lgani, which is Bisbuzzers, that in the Fidik Rebbe's Maimer Bosi Lgani, which was the last hemshich that he printed before he passed away. It was actually printed on the day that he passed away. And in that hemshich, he speaks about Bisbuzzers, the marshal of the king who's fighting a war, and Netzach is the deepest. And everything goes out the window, and even the things that were hidden are now revealed. Right? He throws all the crown jewels. He throws into the war. He puts all his chips on the table. So the nimshal is that in Ein Sof there's the Maila Alin Ketz, and that also becomes, that's usually hidden, right? That's Ein Sof that's hidden, Helem Acher Helem, and now it's also revealed
as Helem.
Right. So my question was always, what does that mean? Right? It was always here, and now it's revealed as Helem. Isn't that a play on words? And how does that fit into the muscle where it's actually put on the field? If I still don't have access to it, so one way that I have of understanding it, and I have no idea if this is correct, but this is how I understand it, is that up to a point, when in times of peace, let's say, when there isn't a war, we operate in a reality where there are things that go that are, there's a civilization, there's a system that is set up, and everyone knows that there's something that's underpinning it. We don't really know what that is or how that works, and that's by design, because it's too much for people to handle. People need to focus on what's at hand, with a sense of security that's provided by something else that's kind of vague and mysterious and hidden. In times of war, we don't have that luxury anymore, and that's what makes war so scary, is that your very foundation is now under threat. And the same thing in the Nimshal is that it feels to me like there was a time where Chassidus is more like you're talking about, where there's a part of Chassidus which is revealed, there's Avodas Hashem which is revealed, and Atzmos is clearly off limits. There's a part of the Godhead, like they like to say, that is completely, that's none of your business. It's there, and it's a foundation. It's the golden Fort Knox, whether it exists or not. That is the fact that you think it exists, or the fact that you know it exists in this case, underpins your entire Avodas Hashem. At some point, at a time of war, you become aware of that as well. You no longer have the luxury of that being hidden. The problem, the risk that you run is, I think, what you're discussing, where you begin to assume, well, if I know about it, that means that I understand it.
Sure. That's
right?
exactly right. It's
right. The hidden has become revealed. And no, that's not what it means. It means that the hidden is no longer separate from what's revealed.
It's Ha'elem Ha'atzmi being revealed, but it's continuing to conceal itself.
Right.
Look, I also have the benefit of having spent a lot of time reading the works of Elliot Wolfson,
right,
Shlita, who really gave me a language very much to understand these terms and conditions. But I think that what gets missed in this is the impact that it has on the psyche of the individual who's hearing these words and witnessing these ideas play out over time. Because if Atzmus, let's say, is something that's graspable, so I'm identifying Atzmus as perfection, So if I already have in my mind that that's something that's accessible, but I haven't taught about what that accessibility means, and yeah, if we all knew and all of the children knew that hasaga, grasp, really means the grasp of negative grasp, which is by way of negation, you touch it, so then, okay, it wouldn't be such an issue. But because people are hearing these ideas, and very often it's around strong drink, and there's, young men speaking to young men, and it's just kind of this brash encounter with ideas. So these ideas become cheapened, and then it trickles down into the lived experience. So then I'm walking around with this concept of perfection, or the graspability of perfection. Now, if I have a notion of perfection or being able to become perfect or grasp perfection, instead of living with that very clear limit point that is so stressed in every one of the mamrim of Chassidus in the previous generations about he'elem ha'atzmi and leis machshavat tfis ve'klal, then psychologically I'm now drawing into my midos the notion of, well, I could be perfect. Even if I'm not trying to do anything, the language has an impact. And so when I start measuring myself with this foreign thought that I can be perfect because I can grasp perfection, so then I start looking at my symptoms or my behaviors as being no longer in the realm of what I should be doing, and I start covering them over, and I start hiding them, and I start ignoring them, and it leads to all sorts of kind of perfectionist tendencies and addictive tendencies of trying to reach some imagined place of self-perfection, which is inaccessible. The most important thing is nefesh hashvala, is the contrite spirit and the humble spirit and the meriruskite that doesn't come from anything other than by recognizing that I am not God.
I think it's important to note here that you're not just talking theoretically. Your practically. Your work as a therapist. You work with
this
people.
Is the root of all addiction. The root of all addiction is the belief in perfection.
Right.
And the pain that comes from its absence and the failed attempts of recreating it by way of substance or idea.
No, but you've seen people who have suffered as a result of this thought process.
I've seen people who have suffered as a result of this thought process. My exposure to people who have, quote unquote, suffered or been impacted by the reality of Chabad has been this thought process, but as reflected in kind of the cultural dimensions of it. Like second, third generation children of shluchim, let's say, where the notion of this all-imposing force of the Rebbe of Lubavitch and being cogs in a machine and soldiers in an army didn't cross the divide of the numerous traumas that populate what our generation can be called as a post-traumatic generation. And so there was more willingness to step away and more willingness to kind of untether oneself from these demands of what Chabad Chassidus seems to impose, and what the language of Atzmus impose, and what the direction of which they were related to the Rebbe was. And then what I've seen most potently is that after the Nasira, after the severing, what a person comes back to when they start reading Rav Hillel Paracher's Bir on Shar Yichud.
1 second, for those who don't understand, by Nasira you mean after people basically throw it all away?
Or when one gives themselves permission to step away from what's causing them pain.
Basically, to approach it the way you approached it at first.
To first walk away from it, though.
Right.
A person can't do that. I thank Hashem very often that I was not born into an active Hasidic dynasty, because then I wouldn't be able to be connected to what I believe to be the Chassidus of our generation, which is the unification of all of this Ramim.
Right. No, so I'm saying.
Right. So you step away.
You step away.
You
not
free
with
yourself.
Not with the intention of coming back, because then it doesn't work. But
No,
by
you step
stepping
away because you're no longer afraid of the lightning bolt.
Right.
And then when you realize that there's no lightning bolt coming, then you could say I could step away a little bit more.
Right.
And okay, so gigs up. Nothing's going to happen if I step away.
Right.
But then what does happen is the stepping away leads to alienation from self. And nowadays we have a slew of ways in which people are trying to discover themselves, and some get caught up in that. But more often than not, people will then go to a Farbrengen that might not be from an identifiable, Chabad source, and they're talking in the language of the Alter Rebbe or what the Mittler Rebbe is saying, and suddenly it's like, where has this been all my life?
Right.
Where's Rav Hillel Paracher been? Where's Rav Aaron Halevi? Where was the teachings that it's only through my deep sense of selfhood and experience and my deficiency, not in a broken type of way, but from a human type of way, that's where I encounter God the most. And people are thirsty for that.
Right, so it's a human thing that you are stressing here again and again, and it's so important. It's so important, and there's this is a question and a problem that we've come back time and again in this podcast in one way or another, where there are people, for example, who have experienced what you experienced. They walked away either from just Lubavitch, or sometimes they walked away from Yiddishkeit entirely, and that's when they rediscovered a connection on their own terms. And so then the question becomes, what do you want for your children? Do you want your children to go through the same thing? And so it's like for example, what are your kids gonna do? And I don't mean to put you on the spot, but like how. In many ways, this was a Lubavitch conundrum from the beginning. They spoke about the Maila of the Gevarna over the Gevarna, those who became as opposed to those who were born. But at the same time, what are you going to do? You're gonna.
Mashiach afsil asya tzadikaya b'tiyufta.
Right.
It's one of my favorite ma'amarim from the Middle Rebbe.
Yeah.
Mashiach comes to restore the truly righteous in tshuva. It's a great question, but the more and more the generation receives its birthright of all of the tzaddikim, even if it's through the particular lens of one tzaddik. I'm very connected to one particular path, but my connection to one particular path enables me to draw in whatever path I so desire. I'm just no longer interested in reading postmodern philosophy or psychoanalytic theory because I don't believe that the neshama of the author is in the book, and it's not going to provide me with the anxiety relief I need. But I think that we live at a time where there's a change underfoot and there's a zeitgeist of spirituality that is drawing forth a collision between what I like to phrase as like the two remaining spiritual options, Chabad and Breslov, which is that my point here is that it's okay to have like this splitness. I grew up in a modern Orthodox community. I didn't become Haredi, but I'm no longer, nor did I ever fundamentally identify with the full doctrine of modern Orthodoxy. Rav Soloveitchik is a bedrock of my thinking, but the bedrock of Rav Soloveitchik's thinking is the Alter Rebbe. So,
right.
Like you're not, these are not,
right.
These are not systems.
Okay, good luck staying pure.
Yeah, that's the meaning. There's a person, someone said to me the other day on a podcast, they said like, for me, Arizal had no impact on my life. I was like, wait, let's just trace whatever realm of Jewish influence you think you have, whether it's Tikkun Olam or whether it's Musar or, like the Arizal is playing a pretty significant role in the development of modern Jewish consciousness.
Yeah.
So my point is that to be mixed up.
By the way, any person who reads the Aleph Beis is deeply influenced by Kabbalah.
Exactly.
Right? The shapes of the letters are from the Beis Yosef, who found them in a kuntras called Baruch Shamar Alpha Besa, which are based on Kabbalah.
Yeah, everything. It all comes to Nahar Hayotzi Me'eden. And I think realizing this, like, what do you think you're talking about? You're talking about mystical Judaism.
Right.
Chassidus didn't come to reveal something that was novel. It came to reveal that which was always already there but hidden. So the question of sociologically and community-wise, meaning, my point is that this is also having its impact on culture. Meaning, there's a whole enclave. If you look at the history of modern Orthodoxy of YU in the last 20 years, you do see a pretty profound impact in the world of teachings of Chassidus. Rav Moshe Weinberger Shlitu I consider my Rebbe to a certain degree, in many degrees, in all degrees, but he is perhaps one of the more successful iterations of drawing the lights of pre-war Chassidus into a post-war modernized perception.
It's so you said it so many times, and it's so interesting to me. Partially because Lubavitch was in Russia, so the Holocaust is more in the periphery in terms of even though the Fiedler was rescued by the Nazis. I don't know if you know the story, by the Nazis out of the Warsaw Ghetto, but that's kind of forgotten or not spoken about. Mm-hmm. But the populace did not, and the Rebbe was also rescued out of Vichy France. But Lubavitch as a whole didn't go through the Holocaust.
Forget the Holocaust, the Sugya of Shviras HaKelim. The
right.
person doesn't need to know what the Holocaust is. Learn the Sugya of Shviras HaKelim through the writings of the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe and the Tzemach Tzedek, and you'll see that, it's all formed around the post-traumatic response.
No, I'm not arguing with you. I'm just saying it's fascinating to me how you bring it up. And in Lubavitch, the whole idea is continuity. Hold on to the past. It's just a very interesting tension because, like I think we were speaking off air, like as much as there might be a truth to that you have to hold tight and be very, very devout to these ideas and these traditions. It's clear to me that we haven't come to terms, that the Lubavitchers that I know have not come to terms with the fact that we live in a different reality than our grandparents. Forget even the fact that
the Admorim didn't write about Shmiras Habris. It's Kemat not present.
Well, they actually, but
there's some places where it's addressed.
No, the interesting thing is, from what I understand, is that was the first Yechidus every Bacher had with the Rebbe Rashab. Okay.
Oh wow!
Right?
I didn't know that.
That's what I've heard, and it was something that was spoken about but not written about. And the Rebbe, I think, was the most emphatic in saying, just don't address it. Just throw yourself into learning. But I'm not proficient enough on the sugya.
No, me neither.
But there's no question in my mind. I'm not even talking so much in spiritual levels, which are not really my. I don't get to dictate what Chassidus should say and shouldn't say. But even I'm talking more cultural levels. Like, we don't live in the times of our grandparents. Like, Lubavitch likes to see the split as before Gimel Tammuz and after Gimel Tammuz, and I argue that the distance between my parents' generation, who were before Gimel Tammuz, and their parents' generation is far wider. The distance is far wider over there than between my parents' generation and my generation. Even though Gimel Tammuz right?
Absolutely.
Their parents' generation grew up in a different world, under completely different circumstances.
The question that you were bringing up before also is that the ideal is not impacted by the real. Meaning, if something is fundamentally true, then it's reasonable to say, why should I care about the changing nature of time when I'm holding on to the innermost kernel of that which remains real? And so I think that there's also embedded with this issue, and I understand it, but there's a lack of a cohesive and unified educational model of what Chassidus Chabad is saying. Now, this is not, God forbid, to come and deny the validity of anything that the Rebbe Rashab wrote. But if a person is not reading the Mitler Rebbe, or if a person is not reading Ayin Beis or Samach Vav, or they're not learning Rav Aaron Halevi or Shar HaYichud with Rav Hillel's Biur, I can't imagine how Chassidus can have an impact on a person's day-to-day life, because a person has to realize that Chassidus is talking literally about finding ourselves down here in this place and a deep awareness of every nick and cranny of the spiritual process. And there's always a hyper-emphasis on unity of failing and growth. If a person is not giving themselves the medicine that is in their cupboard already, so then it's not a surprise that a person is going to feel sick and then begin looking elsewhere.
Right. Yeah, I totally understand what you're saying. I totally resonate with what you're saying, and I've seen it myself growing up, where this jumping over, like there'll be so many times where people will be like, well, like a specific question in Chassidus about a darga and atzilus, which in many ways is more relatively graspable. Now, that's too complicated. The mimer seems to be like, there's a whole pilpul here, but I'm much more comfortable talking about atzmus and dir b'tachtenim, and it's like, dude, something's
the division.
Something's broken here. If you're more comfortable with what isn't graspable over the things
this is exactly true, because the thing that is graspable to us is the fact that, I'm a human being. We grasp the process, which separates the beginning and the end. And instead, what everyone's doing is reading the beginning and the end and saying but the truth of the matter is that no, you can't reach the end, but by way of recognizing that you can't reach the end, you reach the end.
Yes.
They're missing the true emtza of Torah Chassidus, which is that it's both and at the same time. And every moment of thinking you've reached the end, you have to, at the very same moment, remember that no, but I haven't really reached it. It's a love biderech midosav. It's a mediated immediacy, meaning I'm never touching the real thing. The moment I touch the real thing, I've made it something real and congealed.
Yeah. I think I once put it that that there's the pilpul about Malchus of Atzilus is the mom and pop of the economy. Atzmus is like the cash advance bros.
And it has the
finance bros.
Everything.
And it's like there's the same way that the world basically. What are you going to be? You're going to be a schlepper that makes a few bucks here and there. And it's like, but I like honest labor. I don't want to speculate.
We can't. We're missing the point. And then we're going to get stuck in this notion that Mashiach already came, and we have cousins that do that.
Right.
That's what I mean when we say we become, the other side, to the degree that if you take the perpetual relativism out of it, there's no point on the scale in which we grasp the essence of God. Never, ever. Right. We just stop being able to talk about what it might even mean. Now, is there a notzutzutz of the awareness that it's always ever present? Avada, all of the things that any of the Admorim or the Nesiim wrote is true, but it must be understood in its context.
So I wanted to circle back to something you said earlier, because I think this will cast your point, which is a very, very provocative point, in a positive light. I think you said it before we started the conversation.
I hope I'm not being too provocative, but
I like provocative. I mean, not thought provoking.
sure.
Not controversial.
I come with, this is what my Rebbe is, this is what
no,
Ravitchemeyer is always that's how I understand Ravitchemeyer.
I don't think you're trying to stir the pot.
Chalila.
Saying things that thought provoking, not in some kind of antagonistic way. At least I don't feel that way.
No, heaven forbid.
Yeah. So you were saying earlier this idea of Tihid Tzaddik, that people tied up Tanya as like, and this I don't know how it got through the editors, the copy editors. Tanya is a book of the in-betweeners, or Tanya is a book of the average person. Like, no, it's not. It's not like this kind of book about compromise and settling down. That's not what it's about. Right? And you were talking about how, but I think you've explained a little bit, but talk about that.
Meaning the general perspective is that the tzaddik is this metaphysical reality, so to say, that gets planted within each and every generation. Right. And that is true. Parak Beis is already, or Parak Gimel is already expressing to us our role in, the grand body of Adam Arishon and the tzaddikim.
Right.
So that the concept of tzaddik, as it was conveyed from the Baal Shem Tov and the Magid, that's totally true there. But when it comes to people, when it comes to even the Nasi or the Rebbe, I'm not talking with definitions. I think that level of tzaddik has to be understood in its human context, meaning to say imperfect.
Right.
That the tzaddik is imperfect. Right. The most important thing about any tzaddik is that they go to the bathroom.
Right.
No tzaddik is perfect. The impossibility of perfection must be seared in front of our eyes, to the degree that the reason that there are so many tzaddikim throughout the generation is to fix this one mistaken notion that a yid can become that can become elokus, which was what Oso Ha'ish was. So we have to have so many tzaddikim to come and remind us over and over that no tzaddik can be perfect. Now, if I feel that the tzaddik is operating at a level of perfection that is ontologically separate from me, perfect because of their self-mysterious nefesh, perfect because of the effort they put in, that's fine. There's always people who do infinitely more than us.
Right.
That's fine. That's not the issue, because that's not essentially perfect. That's just perfect in relationship to my level of imperfection. But to believe in an absolute static perfection of a mensch is to now do two things. It's to equate the neshama with God, which is what we spoke about before as grasping atzmos, because if I could grasp it, I can be it.
Right.
There's an isser on grasping atzmos, the Leshem says. Why? And the Rebbe had the Leshem on his shelf in his office.
Who was Leshem for those who...
Rav Shlomo Elyashiv. He was an 18th century Lithuanian mystic, kind of the final expression of the Kabbalah of the Gra, and not necessarily someone who had a deep relationship with Chassidus, didn't engage in it, was not interested. He was a real Litvak. Rav Betzal Naor wrote a book about Rav Pinchas Lintap, who was a Lubavitcher Chassid who engaged in his writings. But ultimately, the Rebbe had them on his shelf, which is very cool. And what he stresses is that we learn the lack of perfection from Moshe Rabbeinu. Why do we learn the lack of perfection from Moshe Rabbeinu? That he can't behold. Yeah, and that he wants to grasp the face, and sorry, you can't. You can't grasp my essence.
Right.
And the Lechem says, if we learned it from anybody else, then we would have claimed that their imperfection was symptomatic.
Right.
But by learning it about Moshe, the most perfect of all perfect human beings, what the Torah is telling us is that no, it is choki me chuke habriya she'i efshar sheha nivra yasig es haboira. It is an embedded ontological law in the fabric and texture of reality that the creature cannot grasp the creator. And he says in a letter to someone who's trying to shtach and say, no, you can grasp the essence, he says, why is there an isser on contemplating the essence of God? In Chazal, there's an isser, malamalu malamata. Because to postulate the notion of grasp, or even asking a question, is predicated upon a distance from the object of my observation. If I can think about it or grasp it or have a relationship to it, then I have separated myself from that thing so that now I can look at it from an external perspective. Now, by doing that, I am imposing a limit within the infinite to the degree that I am now separate from the essence of God. And one cannot do that. It betrays a mistaken notion of who we are and who God is. And so this imperfection is built in. And therefore, when we look at the nature of tzaddik, it's not that tzaddik is inaccessible because it represents a different form of existence and it's a reflection of God's perfection, God forbid. It just means that in the relative positioning of my spiritual growth, I can't reach that person's tzidkus, but I also have a tzaddik level within me. And I can reach that level of tzaddik within me. Haraya is that the Tanya opens up with mashpiano so tihet tzaddik v'al tihe rasha. Every person swears to be a tzaddik. And the Tzemach Tzedek points out that Sheva, Maspian, that you make them swear, means it's the Makifin of the Sheva Kochos that have the capacity to awaken an inner tzidkus that rises above the Beinani.
Right.
And as Rav Philip Parcher points out, Safran Shel Beinanim is the Bina. That means we're always struggling, fighting, processing. Shar Yichud Ve'emuna is the Chachma. That's where everything is totally fine. And then Chinuch Katan, which is the secret of why I need to hold on to the wrong idea even when I graduate to the right idea, that's Keser. That holds both of them together. To phrase that differently, Sefer Shel Beinanim tells me how I have to always try and be better. I'm a Beinani. I'm always a Beinani. Shar Yichud Ve'emuna tells me, no, you could be Mevatel yourself to the Oisius and to the light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You're on the Darg of a Tzaddik. Chachma is the level of Bittul where the Orient Sof is Shara. But so now we have a stira. What is it? Am I a perpetual Beinani or do I have access to a tzaddik? Comes along Chinuch Katan that's wedged in the middle, and it says Chanoch Lenar Al Pi Darko. Gam Ki Askein Lo Yasir Mimenu. Chanoch Lenar Al Pi Darko Sot the Heilige Balatanya Miklal De Eino Emes LaAmiso. Meaning, teach the child the derech of Bina. Teach them the derech of Bina. That you always have to be struggling and you can never be perfect. Gam Ki Askein Lo Yasir Mimenu. So that even when you reach the level of tzaddik or Shar Yichud Ve'emuna, and you think you've perfected it and you've reached this level of chachma, you're still not going to forget that you're a Beinani. You're a Beinani and a tzaddik at the same time.
Like Kagain Rabba, Kagain on a Beinani.
Right. To be the tzaddik that holds the light of the Beinani, because without the Beinani, the tzaddik falls into the territory of Tainuk Tamidi and a Tainuk. And this comes out most in Samach Vav, and Lamed Vav in Tanya, and Samach Vav from the Rebbe Rashab, but person has to read it clear and really...
What comes out?
That the tachlis of the Bria is the dir b'tachtoinim, that there's a yerida from Soviv Kalalman into Mamala Kalalman, but the goal is not to go back from Mamala Kalalman back into Soviv Kalalman, as if nothing changed, but you want to draw the Soviv into the Mamala so that you now have a unity between above and below at once.
Right. It's look, that to me is the kind of the gambit of Chassidus is that we can trust ourselves with paradox.
Yes, that's exactly right. That's all I spoke about this weekend.
And paradox. Paradox. I love that word. No. Paradox is very delicate because paradox is like elastic in the sense that the second you lose the tension, it's gone.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
It sounds cool and it exhilarates the mind, but at some point, it's the most demanding kind of thing. You have to hold two opposites at all times.
But this is what the Alter Rebbe gives us, meaning Atzilus is the paradox.
Right.
And Igeres Chaf, which all of the Talmidim wrote about, where it talks about Yesh Me'ayin. Yeah. Where it's that Ihu v'chiyu v'garmayu chad b'hon. In the world of Atzilus, which is the interface between the realm of the infinite and the realm of the finite, it's referred to as their kalim there, but they're not Elokus. Mm-hmm. Don't, God forbid, identify them as Elokus, because obviously they're not Elokus. But the moment you say they're separate from Elokus is the moment you're... So again, the only way to grapple with that is paradox, and the Alter Rebbe says that this is why it's called Raza de Mehimnusa, the secret of faith. Faith is the kli that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives us, or the keser, right? Because it's Ratzon, Tainug, and Emunah. The keser is what gives the person the ability to process and hold paradox.
So how do you look? This stuff is I love this kind of thinking.
But I think it's therapeutically the most healing form of thinking. Also,
that's what I wanted to get to. How do you think it's possible for, or is it possible for a chossid who is less free to kind of take what he wants on his terms? Is it possible for that person to maintain this balance that you're suggesting here? Is it possible?
I think absolutely, because each person lives up and downs. I'm not talking about experiencing downs that are, God forbid, going into deliberate places or doing something that's stepping out of the bounds of what one is comfortable with in order to search out new vistas. I mean, everybody has their taivas but all a person has to do is take seriously what the books that are right in front of them are saying. I think it's 100% viable, unless there's a level of confidence that is so strong to take a Mittler Rebbe and sit with it in the Beis Medrash. We need to open our minds. I guess let me rephrase my answer. I think that Rav Hillel Parcher, that quote that I said earlier about the Mittler Rebbe, that a person can only learn Pnimius HaTorah if they have this natural tzabrachenkeit within them, an awareness that things are imperfect, which is the fundamental antidote to the notion that things can be perfect. So it creates an urgency.
Right.
Rav Hillel Parcher from here was matir learning Pnimius HaTorah on Tisha B'Av and in Avelis.
But you said something off before we started, which was very interesting, which is that you don't learn the Rebbe's Torah directly, because it seems like you want to keep some kind of distance, some kind of objectivity, or some kind of individuality. So my question is, are these two, the idea, the upside of what you're describing, of having that independent thought and realizing you have to translate it for yourself and you have to be there as a person, is very powerful and very important. But even to put it in more practical terms, if the Rebbe Rashab hadn't, let's say for argument's sake, turned the language to a more bold, less
and the mashpiyim in that generation who took it,
right? But it was a lot under his influence too. The Tenchetum was Kol Yetz L'Mechames Beis David. There was a time of war. Everything's very bold and very direct. If he hadn't done that, would he have been able to accomplish what Lubavitch has survived in Russia, right? And so there's these two things. I'm not asking to answer questions, but my point is you. Let me put it.
Shagios miyaven menastaros nakeni. Meaning, none of this is by mistake.
No, but so let me put it in simple terms. I'm not trying to ask you if you think that Rebbe Rashab was right for what he did. We're not. No, what I'm saying is, you put a chossid in front of a Rebbe, he is going to be bottle in front of that person, even not in a spiritual sense necessarily. You are going to be swept away with the charisma of this tzaddik, and it's very hard to look at the sun in the eye, look at the sun with your eyes and say, the sun's imperfect. The light blinds you in the sense that it blinds you of its own imperfections. You feel like it's perfect, right? And so how can you have this army of chassidim, or even not to be an army, how can you have a chassid who's devoted to a Rebbe and still retain his individuality? Do you think it's possible? Can you look at the Rebbe? Can you be a chassid of the Rebbe and say that he's imperfect?
I think a person has to. Not imperfect because of character traits.
Right.
Not imperfect because of behaviors. Not imperfect because of hidden things, God forbid. Right. Not imperfect because the Torah wasn't clearly genius. Not imperfect because he failed in some sort of mission. Not imperfect because there was a mistake. Imperfect by dint of the fact that he's a human being.
Right.
That is a fundamental thing that we must acknowledge. If not, we've lost the script.
Right. Yeah.
If not, we've lost the script. That's what I think.
Yeah, I probably would add a little bit more spice to it. I don't know if you're being careful with it. I think it's if you make it too philosophical or too the way that he's not God. Although I mean that in itself is already a step, right? And that's ultimately the whole idea of a hierarchy. And
that's what the Baal Shem Tov came to teach.
The biggest person is the most bottled to God. So the biggest person is the most not God.
Moshe, yeah, that's
exactly
the most
right. Not God. Like he's a person who most realizes.
This is the schoik. This is the laughter. This is what the Baal Tanya reveals at the end of his life. That the whole thing is to lie with the Hasidim, not lying in a gratuitous, power-hungry way, but to lean into the lie that is reality, and to deal with things on imperfect terms. Ganz alts is b'diavad.
Right. No, but like the Melech by davening had to bow down. I think
100%.
The entire davening, 100%. Right? Because a Melech, the highest person needs to be the most bottle.
So this is what my Rebbe showed. Meaning, all Chabad is is gradations of bittul. That's the language of the spiritual process of Chabad. Bina is, Malchus is bittul through Kabbalah and Chassidus. Zer Anpin is bittul through Ava, Yira, and Dveikus. Bina is bittul hayesh. Chachma is bittul b'metzias. Keser is bittul ba'etzem. As he quotes from the Maggid, quoting from the Rambam and the Ari, the only place in which godliness is going to reveal itself is bittul. Chabad came to be Megala Zayin on Chachma. Chachma is the soif and the tachlis of what Chabad is revealing. I'm not saying that Bina is the tachlis. It's not true. For Rabbeinu, it might be a different process, but Bina is not the tachlis. There's always a return back to Chachma.
Right.
But it's with schlepping the whole process of Bina into it, which includes Bina within Chachma. Meaning the bittul is the main thing, but we have to value the yesh mi sha'oved, that there's this, and that's experienced through limud itself, through birur halacha, through learning Gemara, through the work of eating, through the work of davening, through the work of the nigun. Every ounce of this process that Chabad is giving to a person is a ratza v'shov.
Yeah. It will sound like I prepared this, but I didn't. That hemshech of Tafshin Aleph, it has a beautiful mashal of when you plant a seed and the koyach hatzmicha in the ground. There's a koyach hatzmicha klali, the maimer lekim tache aretz, and then there's the koyach hatzmicha prati for each and everything that's growing. And he describes when the seed goes into the ground and has a coven. And disintegrates into the soil, it pulls not only from the Keach Tzemecha Prati, but also from the Keach Tzemecha Klali. Through the Keach Tzemecha Prati, it pulls also the Keach Tzemecha Klali. All to say, as in the Nimshal, through this, the Hispanus is a coven, is the idea that's beginning to melt in your mind and find its language in your individuality. You pull not only from Bina, you pull from Chachma as well.
From Chachma always.
You pull from Chachma, and the Chachma becomes rejuvenated as well.
Mm-hmm.
Right,
that's the tachlis.
And so, but
that reveals Keser.
The way you're teaching it, it sounds like, is that you cannot, because you'll correct me if I'm wrong. It's not only about recognizing your individuality; it's also about appreciating the tzaddik's individuality.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And if you miss that, it's not just are you too respectful to this? What you're saying is that if you the moment you distance a tzaddik with this kind of what you said ontological difference, that he's fundamentally perfect and you're fundamentally imperfect, you are creating new categories that destroy the very tension that allows this paradox of chassidus to exist.
And then all you can say is halavaya beinani.
Right. Well, that's the point. And the
Exactly.
Beinani only exists because there's this tension of tzaddik.
And then every ounce of shlichus
right.
is, I exist for the sake of the movement.
Right.
And that's good if you're a soldier, but it doesn't, if you're a grandchild of a soldier who, is not, that becomes a little bit alienating. So I think there's a fundamental need to return back to the origins of Torah Chassidus in Chabad Chassidus, and to go back to your point about not learning the Rebbe. The goal is that with this wisdom, you could go and learn any mimer from the Lubavitch Rebbe and see exactly what the Lubavitch Rebbe is saying. The Lubavitch Rebbe didn't make a mistake in what he was describing. He wasn't speaking of a level of revelation. My Rebbe has scrubbed and scrubbed and scrubbed at all of the Makoros to see if such a thing is possible, but the overcome never comes. Right. Lubavitch Rebbe was as pristine and precise in his language, if not more.
Right.
In the terms and conditions that he was using.
Right. Yes. No,
Meaning it's not so with this knowledge a person can then go and properly learn the Lubavitch Rebbe's Torah without, you have to schlep all of the Doros HaKoidmim.
Well, it's like coming to something starting a book from its seventh and final chapter and say, well, I read the book, everything seems to tie up nicely. There must have been no story in the middle,
exactly.
Right? The book begins with they lived happily ever after, and it's like no, there was a whole story here, and you have to go through the story to appreciate where you're at now.
And that's maybe why Gimel Tammuz was such a watershed moment, because if you don't have the first 6 chapters of the importance of Shvira and Simsum and Istalkus and Hispashtus and He'elem and Choshech, and even though the Rebbe touched on all of these sugyos, all of them, nevertheless, you don't necessarily know how to move forward once you feel like, well, I thought we reached the apex, but there's another level to get to? And that's the way spiritual growth works.
Right. Yeah. The first mimer, Bosi Lgani, Tafshin Yud Aleph, the Rebbe speaks about his stalkos of all the previous Rebbeim as the ultimate catastrophe for each generation, but also the ultimate step in the unfolding of the purpose of the Rebbe Tachtonim of this world, right?
And I get it. There was nobody like the Lubavitch Rebbe.
Right.
And there is nobody like the Lubavitch Rebbe. And like I said, halavai, that Mashiach, Mirz Hashem, should come immediately, will reflect the midos of the Lubavitch Rebbe.
Right.
Or carry whatever it is from the Lubavitch Rebbe. But I think that what Chassidus Chabad does for me most is allows me to be comfortable in the movement of imperfection, the process of tohu, the process of the collision between the klal and the prat and the tzibrochenkait and the joy at the heart of tzibrochenkait and the oros de tohu b'kelim de tikkun and the surprise of the need for details and also the radical hishta'avus of it all, meaning every word of the tzaddikim is providing us with ways of living in a world that feels so topsy-turvy.
So let me wrap it up with a final question. I've gathered from you a tremendous respect for Chassidus Chabad and for the Chassidus of the Rebbe, but with the caveat that you maintain a certain distance, right? Both like practically not learning directly the Rebbe's Torah, at least for now, and also it seems identifying as well, like your Rebbe is Rabbi Meir Morgenstern. Although you said like he's your
Rav Weinberger is my Rebbe in terms of my
and then Rebbe and then the Rebbe.
That's tzaddik.
So, right. So and I understand what you say, the value that you see, and you said earlier that you feel lucky that you were born in not into a Lubavitch or Chassidic family.
You know,
your own thing.
Satmar, being born a Satmar before the war means you could choose.
Yeah, I understand, but. Yeah, well, Satmar only began around then.
Meaning like we were very close with the Eilish, but there's a lot of Satmars in Breslov.
Yeah, it was very different then. But talk about Kaidam and Simsum and Achre at Simsum. But is there, the podcast is Homesick for Lubavitch. Mm-hmm. Is there something that you feel you're missing, or something that you wish you had, or something that you long for that you don't have because you don't have that kind of fixed or given identity? Mm-hmm. Is there a lacking?
I don't think no, because I don't think the Nesiei Chabad are a restricted economy. They're all of ours. The Rebbe is all of ours. The Rebbe Rayatz is all of ours. The Rebbe Rashab is all of ours. And there's also conversations beginning to take shape because there is this phenomenon of, secondary ripple effects of the generations of Chabad, where there are Chabadsters coming to, there's the hipster element of it, and there's a nuanced culture and a musical taste and kind of a whole new undercurrent of a remodernization, right? Which is still maintaining the bond to Lubavitch and Chabad, but there's crossovers, right? Meaning my Rebbe utilizes every mimer of Chassidus Chabad. Everything is based on Mamre Chassidus Chabad. And everything is drawn in Chabad, but what remains at the apex of it is the most fundamental klal of what Kabbalah and Breslov is ultimately coming to say, that even though you reach the highest level, it's just the lowest rung on the next level ad infinitum. So I don't feel that I'm missing something, because it's not my community, so I don't wish I lived in Crown Heights. I don't wish that I had, the fervor, the Messiah. I love the respect. What I love so much is that you see people who are, I've seen people who are close to Lubavitch Rebbe. I was with Manis Friedman on the Shabbos once, and he was very silent the whole time. But you got the sense that he had witnessed greatness. I wish I had the schus of seeing the Rebbe. I wish I had the schus of, I know the schus of going to the Ohel. But I also know the schus of seeing like the wife of the Rebbe Rashab's kever, even walking out. And to me, that's on a certain level more astonishing, because the Rebbe Rashab lived, and he was a real person. So it gives me kind of the ability to have a broader view without really feeling that I'm missing anything. Again, I might seem as someone who's bastardizing the chain of Lubavitch Chassidus, but I'm not claiming to hold a key to it. But for me, it's a language, it's a medicinal language. It's a profoundly medicinal language, and it heals and it offers insight. And it gives permission and validates nearly every thought that a person can have about God. Like everything is part of it.
Yes, I realized I did cut you off earlier, and if you remember the point that, because you were making a point about this being a more therapeutic language.
It's owning our symptoms. It's once we get, so many of our symptoms are there because we're uncomfortable with the reality of having symptoms, of being a human being. So by relinquishing the belief that I shouldn't feel like a human being and accepting the fact that I am a human being with my lived condition in the worlds of separation as it expresses itself as the post-traumatic results of the shvira and this and that, so then I can stop adding insult into injury and tend to the injury. Right, I could look at the chisaron and I can figure out what can I do for this. And this is where I think the Lubavitch Rebbe is sodek on every level. The only answer is the fist pump to do more. That's the only answer. But come to that place from a recognition of deficiency, which means that I'm not going to complete myself with the moreness that I do. Still here in America, as someone who lives in Israel now, I don't know if this is video also, but the avoida of Chutz La'aretz is Lubavitch Rebbe is this. For me, the avodah in Eretz Yisroel is more of a Breslover is like this, because it's not so much. It's not about activism. There's no you're there. You just have to focus in. And when the Tzemach Tzedek said Ma'ach Eretz Yisroel do, make it here. I that's something I do wonder. I would wonder what Lubavitch would look like had it made it to Eretz Yisroel, or if the Rebbe is mamish just like the guardian of exile, and until Mashiach arrives, and that's the self-sacrifice of the Nesiim that they didn't come to Eretz Yisroel.
Right.
When I see the picture of the Lubavitch Rebbe in Eretz Yisroel, it reminds me that redemption has not arrived yet. That's what I have to remember.
The picture of the previous Rebbe of the
the previous Rebbe. No, the last Lubavitch Rebbe, the seventh Lubavitch Rebbe. When you see his picture everywhere in Eretz Yisroel,
you see his picture.
It's a reminder that even in Eretz Yisroel, where it feels like this menucha muchletes that you have to cultivate, it's the opposite of menucha muchletes, but menucha is the only tool there. So seeing the picture of the Rebbe is a reminder that no, it's still, you have to have the tnua of his chadshus b'toich tainu katmidi. You have to have that desire to grow ad infinitum, even within the recognition that I'm fine just where I am.
Fascinating. Just to put a fine point on it, it's fascinating how you see in this a willing to reckon with your brokenness and your deficiencies
by way of repair, way of just go weiter.
No, it's very interesting, because in many ways in yeshiva we see it more, or in Lubavitch kind of Lubavitch speak. It's like l'chatchila riber, just jump over all of it, and it could be they're both the same.
It's the same thing. It's meaning, because if you look at the symptom, it's too much. So the only thing to do is go weiter.
But it brings home what we've spoken about here, where the language can be true. That your argument has never been at any point that the language in this or that sefer is missing the point. You're not claiming to make that argument, right? God forbid. What you're saying though is that if you take that language without the context,
then we lose this. Then we lose it.
You lose a point.
Then we lose it. And again, just to end, my Rav Weinberger says that everything that he's been able to do is because he once saw the Rebbe do that to him. That's that koyach, meaning talk about somebody who had no limits,
right,
within the general shape of limitation that is being a human being.
Right.
It's a profound, we're zochet to live in a generation where there's more and more coming out, and there's biographies of Yitzhak Isaac Hamler now, and they're republishing Rav Aaron Halevi's writings, and they're publishing Kapast and Magen Avos, and all of the different iterations of Chassidus Chabad, and Rav Levik, meaning, I don't know, this is for another conversation, but I don't know what people think about when they read Rav Levik's writings.
The Rebbe's father.
Yeah, the Rebbe's father. And then there's nobody who talks more about Gevura and Simsum and darkness and concealment and Kabbalah and Pratiyut as the Rebbe's father.
Well, I don't think most people find his works too accessible, but
some of the funnest.
You have fun with it.
Oh my gosh, they're wondrous. But the Rebbe Rashab ultimately.
No, the Rebbe spoke about them with ultimate
all of them.
wonder.
The Tzemach Tzedek also, my Rebbe said that a person who wants to really get the crux of the matter should learn Or Torah Chelik Inyanim. Inyanim from the Tzemach Tzedek, just to go through that and to see how the Tzemach Tzedek is masbir these Inyanim, and in Derech Mitzvasecha. To learn Derech Mitzvasecha properly, to learn Shar Mitzvahs Atfila, Shorish Mitzvahs Atfila, right, and Shorish Amanas Elokus properly, a person is, you're good to go. You get every Hakdama you need.
Fascinating.
Beseder, this was a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. The music for this podcast comes from the album Repentance Doors by Oren Sor Nadav Vachar and is used with their permission.